Hey everybody, my name is Michael King. Welcome to another inspirational interview here on Artful Minds. It's January 27th, 2025, and this month's interview is with Hester Berry, an artist out of the UK. Hester combines traditional representation with an ongoing exploration of how paint can capture light, time, movement, and climate. Her practice focuses on using marks sparingly, distilling each image to its essential elements. This approach creates a balance between objective detail and open-ended interpretation. So, big warm welcome to Hester. Thank you very much for joining me for this interview. I really appreciate it. It's always great to have everyone or a new artist come in from the UK.
I wanted to be here. Thanks for asking me.
My pleasure. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to bring up about a dozen images or so. Let me just share my screen. And as I do that, if you could just tell us about your journey of becoming an artist and where you are now.
Well, I've always painted and drawn. I've always kind of just loved that from a really tiny age. And I did art at school, and then I thought I would carry it on to university. So I studied in Wales, which is quite a traditional, it was quite traditional tutoring at the time, and lots of life drawing and painting and art history. And it was in a very rural place with spectacular landscapes in Wales. So that was very kind of formative stylistically, I guess that's how I got a lot of my painting knowledge. And then I did my master's at Wimbledon in London, which was the opposite, obviously a very urban environment and very contemporary and theoretical. So I got kind of both spreads, and I've always sold paintings from school age really. So I've moved around the UK a little bit, I teach a little bit, and now I live in Devon, which is a very rural kind of coastal moorlands, lovely landscapes around. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Now, you said you started selling paintings at a school age being what, high school kind of
Um,
school age?
well, I left school at 18, so 17, 18. So I sold a couple of paintings during that time, and then I had an exhibition at the end of my school. So when I was, I think, just at the end of 17, just turning 18, had an exhibition with a friend. We did quite well with that, and it just sort of carried me forwards, I guess.
Well, no doubt. That's there's nothing more incentivizing than having someone pay you money for a painting you did, right?
Yeah, it's good
Absolutely.
activation.
So I guess your more traditional painting start and your lot of life drawing explains why, and I'll share a few sketches that you do quite a few portraits as well. Sometimes you post some on Instagram, but I guess this is where you've honed this skill, right?
Yeah, I think we had a lot. We had 3 full days of life drawing teaching at university, and it was 3 full days a week. And that's a lot of, I mean, a lot of courses, even then, sort of however many years ago it was, didn't teach a lot of life drawing. This one did, and it really set me up for technique. And I've always thought of it as like not the main thing, but a good rigorous discipline to keep my painting tight and kind of well disciplined. But now I'm doing more portrait drawing. It's a good discipline thing, but I'm kind of, I can be more expressive with it, I think, now as well. So I enjoy it just as much as landscape, really.
And if you want to find Hester on the internet, it's hesterberry.co.uk. And you can find her on Instagram with her handle, just Hester_Berry, I think it is, right? All right, so let's get to the big questions. One of them being, firstly, all artists go through a multitude of styles when they start, especially if we start painting at a younger age, right? As we paint more, we slowly develop into what is uniquely ours. And with yours is quite unique, but do you have a defining moment that brought you to your current work?
I would say not one. I can think of several things that have helped me on my way. I can see as I look back, I can think of many different little like turning points, and some of them really major, some of them small stylistic things that have set me on a journey. So a school trip to Berlin, seeing Caspar David Friedrich's painting, and certain artists that I was told to look at or that I've discovered along the way. Monet being a hugely influential one. I've always, so discovering his work and learning about how the Impressionists saw the world and painted has been a big turning point. Having children has been a turning point. even if it's kind of a limitation in some ways, that limitation has, had a big impact on how I work, a positive impact on how I work, I think. Yeah, little things like that. I mean, being taught the colour wheel at university was a big turning point that I always look back on. So I think many things, and life always feeds into it.
Okay, now I'm curious, when you say having kids change your painting in a positive way, is that because you had to limit your time to your
Yeah.
painting and more to your kids, so you had to paint faster?
Yeah, I think when I was pregnant, I think a lot of people thought, well, that's going to be difficult from now on. And I was really adamant that that wasn't going to be the case. So when my little boy Zebedee was, I think, a week or so old, I was like, right, I've got to do something now. I mean, I'd done a couple of drawings of him very quickly, but within a week, I was like, right, I have to do some oil painting. I have to start as I mean to go on. So he fell asleep, and this was a big turning point, actually, this particular painting. He fell asleep, and I thought, I don't know how long I've got, so I can't be precious. This is my first thing. So that's the one important thing, not being precious. But then not knowing how long I'd got meant I had to be really economical with how I painted. The marks, I had to just do the important things, and then anything else was bonus time until he woke up. And the other major thing that happened then was he did wake up. So I had to sit and hold him and feed him and just look at my painting without making marks. And that was really crucial, because the thing of that everybody gets of, I wish I'd stopped half an hour ago or an hour ago. I that pause showed me that I could stop. So that was really crucial as well. So that one first painting after having a child was probably the biggest turning point, actually.
That's fantastic. I mean, those are two pieces of fantastic advice. Don't be precious with what you're painting and capture just the essentials. That's almost like the gospel for plein air painting. Have you ever done plein air painting at all?
Yeah, a little bit. It's not, I don't do so much now. I used to do a bit. It was never my main thing, but it's really important to really put you in close contact with your subject. So you're not losing information. You're right there with it. There are other struggles and limitations of being outside, there are things you can't do that you could do if you were in the studio, developmental things. Working outside has taught me to work quickly. But I think being able to keep that speed in the studio means that I can hopefully go some way into retaining that kind of freshness and spontaneity that you'd be forced to have outside.
Yeah, definitely right. Because you mentioned how long you've been painting, and what's interesting about your website, and I just love this because hardly any artist ever has this, you have an archive, but your archive actually went back to, oh my gosh, 2009 or something like that. It's pretty crazy. So I was scrolling through it, and I can almost, it sounds egotistical for me to say, but I can kind of start to see where you started to shift into your current style, which I thought was really interesting. So if anyone's interested, go to our website, go to the archive and start in 2009 and work your way through. But one thing I came across was 2015, and I'm gonna share my screen here in a second. But 2015 really fascinated me because with the series, they're all so visually dark, but really it's all about the painting and the light. So as I go through these paintings, there's quite a few of them. Can you talk about why you did it and what was the driving force with them?
Yeah, it's interesting actually. 2014, my son was born. So from then on, that's when, I started to be more economical. And I think they are very dark, and people have commented on that before, but I was not, I don't know. People have asked if I was down or something, depressed, or where the darkness was coming from. But really, no, like you said, they are about, I don't really know how to justify it, but you've said it quite nicely, actually. They're not about darkness, they're about the light in that. And I don't mean in a sort of, I'm not trying to say too much about it like that, but the interesting light that you get in darkness. Seeing as I was learning just after the birth of my son to let go of detail and work quickly and loosely, these kind of woody, dark, shadowy places, not menacing places, but just dark. There's a lot of empty space in them, and a lot of sort of interesting, subtle shifts within the darkness that I really enjoyed. So I'm really pleased that you've seen them not as dark, but as about the light, because a lot of people, I don't know, worried about my state of mind when I was painting them, I guess. But, I think there's also a kind of like, I enjoyed that you can't see into the shadows. So there's a sort of just a bamboozling, like, I don't know, dark, shadowy miasma that you just have to accept. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a way, I would think they would attract a viewer more because they can see themselves going into this and wondering what's happening, right? I mean, I just find it so fascinating. Like this one especially, you have a nice dance of darks here that resemble watercolor, but we'll get that into that question in a second. But you can still feel the glowing, and in the front, it's like I can walk here and I can put myself in it. It's off the British Columbia coast for me. This might have been near Devon, right? I don't know. Or is it out of your imagination?
No, I struggle with imagination actually, but it's off the North Devon coast. Actually, I think that's it about the darkness. I think I was starting to realize at this point that if the darkness is paid proper attention to, it's that sets off the light. So light is really my thing, and in order to have that, you have to have those dark shadows. You have to have the full tonal range. It's hard enough as it is to compress natural light into a spectrum that we can represent with our limited paints. White to black is much smaller than light to dark. So you have to pay full attention to the darks if you want the lights to sing out, don't you?
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I think we got to the end of it. All right. But yeah, if you have a chance, go on our website, check these out. They're amazing paintings. I'd literally love to see these in person. But that brings up the question of your darks and how watercolor-esque they are. So I just want to queue up another set of photos here. I just have two to represent, but you could see it in these last paintings that I showed. But you can see it in this piece, like even your lights have some watercolor essence to it. But the variation that you see in the darks, they seem to be shifting, not only hues, but temperatures, and it's morphic. They kind of just sort of move into each other. And I found that fascinating, especially these. These are very watercolor-esque too. As you come more towards the light, they lighten, but they don't seem to intentionally have an edge between them. They just all become very soft. Have you done this for a while, and does this come naturally for you?
I have never noticed a link with watercolors actually. I always think of them as so diametrically opposed, oils and watercolors, because
Hmm.
you start dark to light with oils, the other way around. Oils are there's a lot of opposites with them. But I guess I see what you mean. Like, I have discovered that having a soft brush, because I think a lot of oil painters tend to use a hog's hair brush a lot of the time, and I discovered that having like an acrylic brush or something that's very soft, you can get that kind of soft transition where the colors become a little bit more nuanced and the shades become more nuanced. But I think that's why you get that softness there. I just remember, like with those wooded paintings that you showed before, noticing all sorts of things, like how you might make a black from two opposite colors, and a go-to that a lot of artists have to make their blacks might be something like blue and brown. But I noticed that if you were to mix red and green or yellow and purple, there's a real like richness to the blacks you can get. I mean, black seems to be black, but there it's not quite, is it? There's a difference to them, and that interested me. But also, I think when you're looking into the shadows, I'm very objective. So when I said I have no imagination, I had to struggle with imagination. I honestly see all those little shifts in the shadows. It's what when you notice things in your peripheral vision that you can't quite, when you try to then focus in on it, it goes. So I'm trying to catch those little shifts that you have in your peripheral vision that Monet was so amazing at catching. They're kind of realistic more than a choice, I think.
Nice, nice. And you came about seeing this shifts in your peripheral vision more from painting from life than probably photos, correct?
I think I spend a lot of time outside looking, sketching, and then I work from photos because I want the colors to be totally spot on. I have relied on color notes in the past, but I want the colors, absolutely, and the light as close as I can. So I do use photos for my paintings, which keeps the colors fresh. But the other thing is I keep the photos, I have it on my phone so that I'm not printing them. So they're not big. The photos are never bigger than, that. So that means that I don't get any detail. I can just focus on the colors. But having spent time outside, if I do, I do something outside so that I'm processing it more thoroughly than having just taken a photo. And I try and, as I'm outside, I try and do like grounding exercises, where you're engaging all the senses. So I'll notice what I'm smelling and hearing and the temperature and everything, so that it's more firmly embedded in my mind when I come back to the studio to paint.
Gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, so you really, when you take the photo, but you stand there for a while and you really observe more than anything, right?
Yeah, I try and like I tell my children to do this when I'm walking with them, to take a deep breath so they're actually, sucking the whole experience in physically. So
Yeah.
it's sort of more firmly embedded and the memory is better, and you take a bit of it with you then if you breathe it in.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I have to agree with you now that I think about it. The more you pause, the easier it is to reflect, isn't it?
I even think, even if you haven't got anything, I've got an app on my phone. I mean, I have a small sketchbook so that I always have it with me, in this excellent little painting kit that I take with me everywhere. So I'm always ready to do a quick drawing. But if I am somewhere where I don't have it, I have a really, really crude rudimentary app on my phone, so I can just do something, some marks, even if I don't look at it again. Just the act of doing it is
Oh yeah, yeah,
valuable.
yeah. That reminds me, I saw in one interview too, you talked about a situation where you might just sketch on your hand with your finger to
Yeah, I was gonna say
process it,
that. It
right?
looked a bit weird. You have to make sure no one's standing around you looking at you. But even that, because you're doing it, you're looking, you're doing it, it's the same as doing a drawing and then not looking at it again.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same process.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's just a way to reinforce it more or less,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, looking at your work, I also see a lot of negative shapes, which I find fascinating because let's face it, that 80% of the painters, maybe more, paint positive shapes, but occasionally you come across someone like you who paint more negative shapes. Let me see where part of the question. You carve out uh the shapes you want by painting what's around them. And I'm going to share my screen with this about how you lay in your base of the darks to allow for the lights to cut in, and seeing some of the sped up paintings of yours from a painting class that was online. I see you start a lot with darks and then you move into lights, but can you talk about your process for this a little bit?
So I think that it's quite useful in oils, I think, to go from dark to light. Obviously, watercolors other way around. Oils going from dark to light. I think it's just really difficult to work darks back in afterwards and keep them dark. So I try and kind of do my darks and then move on without going back if possible. So moving gradually lighter. And that means that my darks stay very dark. And I find it, for whatever reason, I find it much easier to keep lights clean going on later than darks clean going on later. So that it was just that practical thing. The advantage of that, though, is that the because the light is going on later, so the light becomes the positive space. The light is the thing that then has real weight to it. So often, if in order to put down those later marks, you need a palette knife, or a thicker paint, so the light is thick and substantial and weighty and comes out at you. And it's another way of, I think, creating the illusion of light being, of widening the spectrum a little bit more. So if light is so much more impact than than if you were to put it on flat, or it just hopefully gives it a bit more weight. That's kind of what I'm thinking. But the other thing, I guess, is a lot of people, when I'm teaching, sometimes people say, no, I like to paint from the background to the foreground, but it's very helpful when you're trying to represent something in front of you to be as objective as possible. And if you're being objective, you can't acknowledge what is background and what's foreground. You just have to paint it as you see it. And if you can do that faithfully, you'll create the impression of background and foreground without thinking about it. So painting negative spaces is almost just, yeah, they're just spaces, if you see what I mean. They're not necessarily if you're being objective, they're not negative spaces, they're
Hmm.
just spaces.
Yeah, true,
Yeah.
true, true. Yeah. And I guess this is why you hear traditionally you want your darks thin and your lights thick to have that impact that you're talking about, that your lights stand out, right?
Mm.
And so this kind of brings me to the question, and this is kind of quirky, but I noticed a trend in your painting is you create a lot of marks and scratches, but there's one that always shows up and it's kind of like a circly scratch, oblong circle. And I'll just share my screen and I'll kind of point them out. I mean, you got this little one here. You got all of them down here. Boom, 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 boom. They're not really scratches, but they're just marked with a brush. In here within your fire, you have these circular marks. How did these come, or are they instinctual, or have you even noticed them before?
They're kind of instinctual. I think they came through for different reasons, and then I liked them just for their formal quality, so carried them on. So for example, to represent a telegraph wire or a contrail, a scratch in the sky, it's less clumsy than painting it on. Grass, little blades of grass in the foreground, something as simple as that. They looked better, they looked more real if I'd scratched them in, because the ground I use underneath the paint is a color that kind of works. It's a warm, like sandy, woody, rocky color that just tends to be appropriate in lots of situations. So I realized that I can scratch or wipe through to the ground to get highlights, foliage, all kind of things like that, that creates a more defined mark, but also, if I want, a more aggressive mark. It's a way of, there's a painter called David Tress who's inspired me an awful lot in the UK, and he puts such energy into his paintings. If you see a video of him painting, he's so, he could be so aggressive with the knife or the paintbrush, and that adds so much movement. So there was that, but there's also, I think, the circular ones that you're talking about. So that's the scratching, that kind of a way of getting some aggression into the board and movement. The circles, I think I remember the first time I did that was while trying to find different marks and have a mix of marks aside from just the large ones I used. There were some ripples or bubbles or something in a river, and so I tried to kind of capture that, and then I just realized it worked quite well, and I needed to balance the shape over here where it didn't belong, like up in the trees or something. And I just think yeah, I don't know, it worked, and it's a bit intuitive. It doesn't always work. I don't shoehorn them in because sometimes they're just not right.
Yeah.
But also sometimes it's like, the light you get around someone's head when they're silhouetted, those shapes just appear all over the place, and they feel like they fit sometimes.
That's interesting. I have to look for that more. But what I found interesting, you mentioned that you put a mark over here just to balance something else, and I think that's important to people listening. Is that you can balance out a painting with a stroke of paint, and it doesn't have to be anything. It doesn't have to be a person or a dog or a fence post. It can just be a mark, and all of a sudden you have that balance. And I think that's really important to hear.
Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, there's so I'm quite loyal to the photo. I never change anything or take anything out, except that things disappear because I don't include much detail. If it's smaller than a brush mark, it might not show up, that kind of thing. Yeah, so I'm quite loyal to the image. If it needs something else, and I mean a mark, not a dog or a fence post, then it goes in. But sometimes it might be, quite often I'm drawn to the image because of a spot of color. So I'll do a painting, and it's only when I finish the painting that I realize there's like a traffic cone, or quite often my dog's bum in the painting, which happens so often because she's been, so I've got two dogs now, but one of them, the older one, has been my painting companion for 14 years. So when we go for a walk, she's always ahead of me, and I see something I want to get a photo of to get the colors, and she's so kind of like, when I call her back, she doesn't want to come back. Quite often there'll be just a little smoosh of brown in the corner where she hasn't got out quickly enough. And I've taken the photo, looked at it, it works, so I just paint it dogmatically, objectively, and dogmatically.
Oh, that's hilarious.
And yeah, so, but I only discover things like that when I finish the painting and I zone back in.
That's funny. Now I'm gonna have to go back through all your
Yeah,
paintings
it's
and look
like
for this brown
spot the dog's
smush.
bum.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I guess so when you start, like the demos that are on YouTube are really fast, and it looks like you focus directly into the painting with the intent of putting down the shapes you see within the darks, or do you just start randomly and then start focusing on the darks?
No, I start kind of, I'm looking for the underlying structure straight away, a bit like a no-tan sketch, I guess. Where you're just really trying to simplify light and dark. I guess actually in the first instance, it's even simpler than that. It's the lines that really simply underpin the composition that go down first, almost like an abstract. It's like the whole. If I had to stop at any point in the process, I'd still have a landscape that worked. So the idea to start off with the underlying structure that feels good for it, in its just simple composition, and then I'll put the darkest shadows in, and they tend to need to balance out so that I can see it's working as a no-tan sketch, but while doing the painting. But the only thing is, I guess I'll go wider so I can be a bit freer and looser. It's the right direction, but you can just launch straight in. It's not like, with watercolors where you plan it all out and you have to be careful. It's just launch straight in. but doing the right kind of thing. It's then as I get further in, then I have to slow down and be a bit more considered with every mark.
Gotcha. So going back to your starting of a painting, when you're mixing your darks though, are you like much like you said before, are you going into the green and reds instead of the blue and the siennas, I guess, to make your darks?
Um, I think generally I start with the black I tend to favour is French ultramarine and burnt sienna, unless it feels like it needs a different one. Burnt sienna and French ultramarine are a good if you're using like artist quality pigments. The problem is with starting your base black as Viridian and quinacridone magenta, you're quickly gonna it's gonna cost a lot and not necessarily gonna do much more for the blacks than French ultramarine and burnt sienna, which are relatively, cheap. So I tend to do that, but I might accent them if I need to. Yeah, those two opposites tend to be the best ones I work with.
Oh, that's so funny. We have the same mindset. Very economical in the paints we have, right? Or that we
Yeah.
use the majority of. Absolutely. Yeah. Now, so does that mean you have a set palette? Obviously, ultramarine and sienna, not to get through all your colors, but you work from a set palette for all your paintings. You don't really change it up, do you?
I'm always up for change. I'm always up for, but I tend to sort of discover things that work really well that will minimize my kit and then not deviate if I don't need to. I love discovering new things, so I'm always open to new ideas. But I guess when you say palette, do you mean like actually what I use on the palette? Because I've got my paint set is quite restrict. My set of paints is relatively small, but I feel like I've got everything I might need. And then I won't limit myself to what I'm actually using on the palette. I'll use whatever I need. I think it's got to be as rich as the painting dictates. So I don't feel like I limit myself. I feel like it's rich enough to get everything I need out of it.
Yeah.
So I think like maybe a useful thing that I find is to have two colors from every hue so that you can kind of reach as far as you need and you've got all bases covered. But then there are a couple of extras that I like. So I like an Indian red occasionally. Naples yellow deep is a lovely one as well. It's just the color of sunshine hitting the earth, isn't it? So that's really useful. Occasionally, I'll treat myself to something, something special like, I don't know, green gold or something like that. Do you know, I think I might actually treat myself to an Indian yellow. That's what I was teaching this week and somebody had Indian yellow and I just thought it looked so lovely and I've always known the story behind it.
Mm.
So I think that's my next treat when I think I deserve a little something.
I'm interested in what you're doing there because it's an amazing color and it tints so fantastic. I could just imagine what it's going to do to your light. It'll just punch it right up.
I use a cadmium deep hue for my warm yellows. So it's like it's not real cadmium. But then I saw this and I just thought it looks like what I use, but more, like more intense.
Yeah,
So
absolutely right.
it's interesting as well. When have you held um a tube of Indian yellow and also held in the other hand a tube of cadmium yellow that is really similar in color and tone and everything, exactly the same size. The weight of the cadmium is that the tube is so heavy because of all the metals. It's really
Yeah,
interesting.
it's
These
quite crazy, isn't it?
pigments.
How heavy it is. Yeah. If you ever get like a flake white replacement paint in white,
Yeah.
it has a substantially more zinc in it than titanium. It's still mixed,
Mm.
but that tube weighs so much. I think it weighs heavier than the cadmiums. It's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never had a lead white because of children. I mean, I paint in my studio. There's a lock on my door. I wear gloves so that it's quick and easy to take everything off. But still, I try and stick away from the real. I mean, none of them are that edible, are they? But try and stay away from the particularly nasty ones. So I've never had a lead, and I don't think I've ever had a cadmium. So while I was teaching, I was trying these things. But yeah, I try and
Yeah.
be safe.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, your paintings have a unique quality that I see beyond expressive marks, although you have amazing marks. Firstly, your lights have a digital quality to them, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. And when I say digitally, I mean when you paint digitally, you have opacity at your fingertips. Any color, any hue, any chroma, any intensity can have an opacity that bleeds over into each other. If you remember the paintings with the watercolor darks I mentioned, and how the light cascades over those mountains, that's kind of what I mean by the digital quality. But I also think it's due to how clean your mixes are in the paint application. So would you attribute this to your ability to lay in a mark of paint and just leave it?
I think if you're gonna paint, I get asked this quite a lot, how I keep my marks clean. And when you're working wet on wet, it is doable. It's something people really struggle with. It is doable, but you have to sort of be sure of what you're going to do and do it once. So like I always liken it to archery or something, where you take you prepare the shot first. You know, you have to think where it's going to start, how fast it's going to be, how you're going to get from A to B, how you change the angle of the brush. I think of everything so that I only have to do it once. If you go, you know, when you see someone paint like that, you two strokes. If you do that, it's kind of, you're going to pick up what's underneath. So I'm very strict, but it's taken a long time to learn to do that, and a lot of kind of discipline until it's ingrained. So if, like, maybe I'll hold a cloth so that I've, you know, actually make sure I've got one in my hand so that I'm kind of primed to wipe it and then go back in rather than dirty it. So one mark at a time. And also just doing it enough, you have now the experience of it paying off. One mark at a time seems very slow, but in the long run, actually, it's a lot quicker, obviously, because it keeps it cleaner. But it's interesting what you say about digital, because I always think of, I have all these ways I've kind of worked out of painting. And then I realized that the best way to describe them or justify them quite often is to liken them to what a computer will do, because a computer is so objective. It's all it does. It's objective. So it will get exactly the right color and put it in exactly the right place. It won't think, oh, but that's mist over something else, or that, but that's a reflection. It will just do it as it sees it. And that's quite a good way. It sounds very unromantic, but it is a good way to see it, and it's helped me a lot. I think of you know, Cézanne's quote of Monet, that he's only an eye, but my God, what an eye, you know, as in it's all he does is see, but he sees so loyally and so truly. And that kind of fits to a computer as well, which is a bit disappointing, but it's true.
That's so funny, but it's interesting to hear you say that. But it also comes down to one of your statements you said before is don't take it precious. And you got to put down that mark of paint and not hope for the best, but you have to be conscious where you're putting it, and you have no choice but to leave it. And if you don't feel it precious, then it can stay longer, right?
Yeah, but that kind of ceding of control leaves, it gives a bit of movement and a bit of, it's like the human touch versus, you know, like a hyper realist painting. You're not trying to, well, I'm not trying to fight against the paint. I love the materiality of the paint. So if like a wild splash doesn't go in exactly the right place, it sort of hopefully adds to it, you know, rather than needing to be absolutely strict.
Interesting. Okay, so if you would put on a nice thick brush stroke of light, do you ever have a tendency to just take a palette knife and take it off, kind of rework it, and then go in again?
And I find if it goes wrong, I have to like force myself away, and then I have to have a good think. If it will do, and I don't mean settling for less, but if it will do, then I leave it, because often that first mark, that first kind of energetic mark, well, is the best for whatever reason. It's sort of the most impulsive. It has the more weight to it. If I just can't live with it, then it's very unlikely I'll go back in and fiddle with it, because that rarely works. The only way to undo something is to scrape it off and just start at it again. But then you've got the risk of removing what's around it. So it's a bit of a gamble. I think I just try to plan really carefully before I make a mark, so things don't go wrong. But you know, obviously they do. And there's a line. I have to just assess whether it's worth fiddling or worth leaving imperfect.
Gone through a lot about your painting process, but what do you like the most? Do you like the walks capturing the information? Do you like the initial start of your painting? Do you like the finish of the painting? What brings you the most joy?
I guess, I mean, being outside is like, feels like the end goal. That's the, being outside in nature is, maybe that's certainly one of the major parts of it, I think. Yeah, I think that's a really important, but I think equally the doing it, not the starting it, that's daunting, and sometimes it seems like an onerous task. I think every time I start, I do feel like I have to push myself to start. I don't know if that's a bit of a disappointing thing to say, but I do, you know, it's a big task ahead. But as soon as I get going with it, I'm into it. I tend to struggle more towards the end, because I guess the doing it is great. The doing it is what I'm born to do. finishing is generally like an arbitrary point somewhere along that way when I've done maybe hopefully 2 marks too many rather than, you know, 100 marks too many. So finishing it is, I don't know, it's difficult to say when it's finished. It's just sort of the most sensible point to stop before I start ruining it. So finishing it is just like a bit of a nail biter and a bit stressful. And I have to kind of, if I don't feel like I've done it justice, or if I don't feel like I have finished it, I won't be able to go to sleep. I won't be able to engage with, I'll go downstairs out of my studio in my attic, go and have my dinner with my family or something, and I won't be engaging with them and being a decent human being if I feel like I didn't do it well enough. So I'll have to come back and fix it somehow.
The issues with having a studio in your house, eh?
Yeah, but you know,
Yeah.
I love it. I've had studios elsewhere. I've had, you know, I've had studios in whatever institutions I've been studying in, and I really like being able to paint whenever I want, you know, just
Absolutely right.
and live with it. And so yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And you said an interesting thing about there about when you're starting the painting, it's quite daunting. But when you first make your first marks, you get into it. I think this is an important statement for a lot of people who don't understand how you can paint, you know, 2 or 3 paintings at a time, or, you know, 10 paintings in a month. Like, how do you paint so much? How do you paint so much? And it's just, you got to get started. And once you get started, it just becomes this joy, right?
Yeah, I think I always do something within a day at the moment, because I mean it's changed over time. I didn't always work like this, but I've realized that I might not be the same person tomorrow. You know, I might have completely gone off what I'm doing. So for that reason, I don't choose what I want to paint basically until I get up to my studio, because I might change my mind. And I can't, if I'm into it, I don't want to stop. I don't really want to have a break. I just want to see it through, you know, because it's this process. So to interrupt it is quite stunning, I think.
Okay. Yeah, the process is an amazing thing, right? Now, go back to a little bit to your brushes where you talked about creating that soft edge and whatnot. But do you use anything besides brushes and palette knives in your paintings? Do you ever have this one favorite odd tool you just pull up and use it?
I use nails, as in not my fingernails, but you know, like a metal nail sometimes, or the back of the palette knife, the back of the brush to the handle. I use a rag to wipe quite a lot.
How did the nails come
Nails.
about? They're sitting beside your easel one day, or
Well, you know, we were talking about scratching. My palette knife has a curved edge. The end of the paintbrush is quite thick, so I tend to get a wider mark with those things. Oh, I know. I sign my name with a nail because I don't want big, chunky, bombastic signature, you know, because I have to think really hard about where I'm putting it then. So I sign my name with a nail, and then it can just be small and not distract from the color. So that's why. But then as it's there on my easel, sometimes it's useful for, you know, those bubbles and little circles and things.
yeah, yeah. Okay, because more or less it's because that has a sharp point to it, right?
Yeah, it's just
Yeah, that's
different
interesting.
mark, different type of mark from palette knife.
Yeah, yeah. And so then your brushes, are all your brushes now more synthetic, and that's how you get the aesthetic of your paintings, or do you still have your Augere
I
brushes?
don't actually have a hog's hair. I haven't used one for a while,
Hmm.
actually. I like the synthetic ones because I can still get brush marks, but I can't get the softness. And if I'm working thin at all, it's harder with hog's hair because it kind of digs right down.
Yeah.
Because I use board, rather a smooth board rather than canvas. So it's very easy to kind of the ends of the bristles to scratch what I'm doing. So synthetic just works best. It's not that it has to be synthetic, actually, you know, like squirrel hair or something would do, I
Hmm.
guess, but I'm not precious about them. I don't have to get expensive ones. They just have to be the right size, the right thickness, not too flexible. Yeah, but I mean, I'd never rule anything out. It's just what I've got at the moment. I may go back to hog's hair. I like the idea that I might change and suddenly require new things.
Yeah, for sure. And so it looks from your paintings though, you start and stick with relatively large brushes throughout, except for some of them maybe finer, smaller marks.
Yeah, I will. So if I'm painting on something kind of this size, like printer paper size, I've got a brush that's 3/4 of an inch, and I don't tend to go any smaller than that because I can do everything. If it's a flat brush, you know, like a chisel brush, I can do anything I want with that, really. I can get a really small mark or a fine line with that. And if I'm doing a bigger painting, I'll just scale the brush up. But The only thing I can't get with a chisel is one specific type of mark, and I have a thin brush just for this reason, and I don't do it in every painting. If I want a thin line, because I don't do lots of detail, so it's not for detail, but if I happen to want a thin curve, I need a thin brush just for that reason. That's the only reason I need to go down a size, really.
Gotcha. Yeah. So it's a tool of need more than just for the sake of using smaller brushes, I guess.
It used to be there just as sort of a safety blanket, just in case I needed to go
Mm.
smaller, but I realized I wasn't using it except for that very small
That's
reason.
great. That's great. Now, when you mentioned going to larger paintings, does that mean you start off with studies in small pieces before you jump into your larger studio, or sometimes you just go straight large?
I just go straight into it. Whatever I'm doing, I go straight into it. So I will do sketches when I'm out, but I won't look at them when I'm in the studio. I won't do those no time things. I only do a small preparatory painting. It's for a commission, and I need to kind of okay it before I move forwards with it. More often, if I left up to my own devices, more often I'll do a big one, do a small study afterwards as a kind of like, I don't know what, as a sort of, if I enjoyed doing it, I want to do it differently and see how it could have been, reducing those marks even further and being even more economical and succinct with the marks, I guess. So yeah, occasionally I find myself doing a smaller version of a big one, but never the other way around, except for
Interesting.
the
Trying to
first.
trying to simplify the scene even more, but in
Yeah.
reverse, right? That's interesting. Okay, so that brings a question. When you do paint, how much emphasis do you put on shapes? Like when you're painting your darks, is it all about getting the correct shape in the right spot in relation to other shapes?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it depends. The thing's got to work. The composition's got to work and balance. Some paintings are looser than others, looser than others. If it's a particularly loose painting, the marks don't matter as much. I mean, primary is still light and color. That's the primary thing. And if I can do that and get the colors spot on, then I think we can make more kind of leaps of imagination with the marks. You know, like when you blur someone's face on the news or something to make them anonymous. I see it a bit like that. Or if you pixelate something, you know what you're looking at because of the colors, even though you haven't got the details. The shapes are important, but not as much as the colors. The large shapes are important. The smaller shapes may be more stylistic, you know, more kind of artistic license sort of choices. But I would say if I've got a path or a road or something, a building, I don't tend to paint big buildings. I don't know. They don't often do it for me. But if I do, like perspective has to be correct. Then I have to concentrate quite hard. If I'm painting a recognizable landmark, I don't want to be really strict. But if it's wrong, that's the problem. I think that's the thing. When things that you can be really loose, you can be really expressive, it can be not perfect, but when things are wrong, that's when you can't willingly suspend your disbelief anymore, and it falls apart a little bit, I think.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. So while you're talking, I brought up this image and I just want to share it. It is a building though. But
I hope I've done the perspective right if you're going to share it.
oh yeah, the perspective's right. But it talks about everything you're mentioning about how your smaller shapes are there representing smaller shapes, but they're not too intricate.
Mhm.
And everything's just broadly put in. You got the what I call negative shape, but you put this paint to cut into that. It's quite interesting to see what you were just talking about in relation to this piece. That said, are you able to, in a minute or less, talk about how this painting came about, if you remember?
Yeah, well, this was when I where I teach in Germany. There's this the house that belonged to kind of the founders of the lovely studio I teach, Bildwerk in Germany, and this was like an important house in its history, the Ice House. Then, well, basically, regardless of that, though, the light on it was beautiful at the time. So I say all of that, but really, what was important was the light was gorgeous and the colors right then and there drew me. And I wanted to do it. It's only a small painting. I wanted to do it as simply and almost like a summary. I wanted to do it as simply as possible, and the marks to be as loose as possible, but not wrong. So, like, I had to get the angles correct, the colors and the angles correct, I guess, and then the rest could be as indistinct as possible.
Yeah, interesting. And what we see here is your signature, and you mentioned about scratching in your signature. But how important is the signature for you? Do you take your time? Do you contemplate for a couple of minutes before you put it in? Or do you just slap it into the bottom right-hand corner every time?
It's mostly bottom right hand corner, but if it won't look good there, then it's bottom left hand corner.
Yeah.
There's been one or two paintings where I've just faffed about for like 10 minutes and thought, I can't really fit a signature in here. I'm just gonna have to sign the back or something. So occasionally, if it's just
Oh,
gonna ruin it, but normally because it's so small, I can normally fit it in without butchering it too badly because it's just so small and kind of like it's quite inert because it's not a color.
yeah, it's interesting. And I guess that's an advantage of being able to painting within a day is you can scratch your signature in the end. You ever work on anything a little bit longer for a week and it dries, you don't have the option to scratch?
Not at the moment. No, not at the moment. I have done. Yeah, I have. I just haven't got the attention span these days.
Interesting.
Probably, actually, that's probably since having kids as well. Now I come to think about it, it's all like one day to the next sort of thing. But I think it also keeps it fresher. So I've become strict at that, and it keeps it. I think fresher and more spontaneous, and stops the risk of over fiddling.
So this process that came about for the need to paint in a limited amount of time during your kids' naps has turned into something you want to just maintain regardless if the kids grow up and leave the house, you're gonna
Well,
maintain that.
yeah, I hope so. I mean, there's 4.5 years in between them, and I noticed that old habits started to come back in, and then so I had another baby and just sort of topped up again, and now it's a little bit more ingrained. They say you have to do things 3 times, but hopefully just twice will do it. Learn things 3 times.
Oh, that's so funny. All right, so we're almost at the end here, and there's two questions that I'd love to ask everybody, and we'll start with what's the best piece of advice you've been given?
The best piece of advice I've been given,
Hmm,
but the best piece of advice was probably my grandpa, who was not a painter, but I just remember him saying, paint what you see, not what you think you see. And that has always stuck with me. And it's what I always tell students. Just that simple thing has really formed everything. And I've noticed other artists do it, like with Monet, seeing with an innocent eye, like with the way computers see and represent when they're printing photography. That's really kept me going. I think that's simple mantra.
okay, so I have to ask if your grandfather wasn't a painter, how did he come about this
I don't
saying?
know. I don't know. Sadly, he died quite a long time ago, so I haven't asked him how he came up with that little nugget of wisdom. I was quite young, so I probably
That's
didn't
fascinating.
enjoy it so much then. It's
That's so funny. All right, and lastly, what is the top piece of advice you would give others?
I would definitely say just do more. That's the thing that before children, I wondered why I wasn't just doing more and more, painting more. I always wished that I could get on with stuff. And since having kids, time is more precious. So I just get on with it, really. The advice that I would give is just do more of everything. And however you have to do it, do more sketching, do more drawing. If you have to have a smaller sketchbook or something that's easier to handle, or draw with a biro, rather, a ballpoint pen rather than your oils, do that. Go to all exhibitions, try everything, do rubbish drawings, 30-second drawings, and prioritize doing over planning. A lot of artists I know have ideas and ideas and ideas, and then they kind of drop off the conveyor belt of ideas and things don't get done. So I think just do more and do everything if that's a manageable task.
No, don't. When it comes to painting, I think that's great advice, right? Just get out of your hole and just pull out the paints and do it. Yeah,
Yeah, and
that's
see
fantastic.
everything. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And with that, if anybody who doesn't know Hester, you can find her on the interwebs. We have hesterberry.co.uk, and she's on Instagram with the handle Hester_Berry. And I just want to say, Hester, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this conversation. It always goes fast when it's amazingly interesting. So I appreciate you attending this evening for yourself. Um, and everyone who attended, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Lovely to talk to you, Michael.
All right. Until next time. Cheers, everyone.